The big news from this past week is that all of the Bon-Ton stores are shutting down. It's a strange situation because that statement doesn't properly convey how big of a story this actually is. Bon-Ton is a chain of 60 department stores located across 9 different states, but that's not even the beginning of it. Bon-Ton is also the owner of 6 other department store chains. You may have heard this story on the local news and not even realized it because they may have focused more on the store that's more popular in your area. I admit I didn't know how to properly title this video. Unless you're from one of those 9 states and live near one of those 60 locations, the name Bon-Ton probably doesn't mean anything to you. So let me properly express what exactly is affected by this in a way that you may be able to relate to. In addition to those 60 Bon-Ton stores, this company also owns 52 Carson stores located in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. On top of that, there's 49 Yonkers locations located in these 7 states. Also, they own Herberger's, a store with an odd name that I've never heard of, but there's 44 of them across 11 different states. Next, they own Elder Beerman's, 31 locations across 6 states. There's also Boston Store, which is 14 locations that are local to Wisconsin. And finally, if you're from Illinois, you may be familiar with Bergner's and their 12 locations. It all totals to 262 locations. All of these numbers are from the end of 2016. They've had some closings since then, but what you see here is more reflective of how they've typically operated. With the exception of one, all of these stores go back to the 1800s, and with the exception of Bon-Ton, none of them started as part of that company. Here's a quick overview of how they all came together. In 1985, Bergner's acquired Boston Store. 4 years later, they also acquired Carson's. Let me introduce a new company to the mix. It's called Profits, spelled with too many T's and too many F's in my opinion. In 1996, Profits acquired Yonkers. In 1997, Profits acquired Herberger's. In 1998, Profits acquired the combination of the 3 stores that Bergner's formed: Bergner's, Carson's, and Boston Store. So to recap at this point, we have Yonkers, Herberger's, Bergner's, Carson's, and Boston Store, all now owned by a company called Profits, with too many T's and too many F's. Also in 1998, Profits acquired Saks Fifth Avenue, yet another department store. As a result of that one, they changed their name from Profits to Saks. I realize all of this might be hard to follow, especially since you're probably hearing most of these names for the first time, and because I've yet to relate any of it to Bon-Ton. One quick detour, then it'll all come together. In 2003, Bon-Ton acquired Elder Beerman, a big acquisition, since Elder Beerman was the 9th largest independent department store chain. Alright, that was the detour. Let's bring this all together. In 2005, Bon-Ton made a very large deal with Saks. Bon-Ton gave them $1.1 billion, and in return, they received Yonkers, Herberger's, Bergner's, Carson's, and Boston Store, adding 142 stores in total and basically doubling their locations. Now, if we look back at our graphic of department store chains owned by Bon-Ton, it should all make sense. 5 of those chains came from this deal with Saks, and the other one was bought 2 years earlier. That was a quick overview of how all these department stores came together. As far as I know, each one of these is very similar to each other, and actually fairly similar to any department store. If you're familiar with Macy's, Sears, Kohl's, you're basically familiar with Bon-Ton. I'd say they are more geared toward women though, considering the thing they sell most of is women's apparel. Men's apparel is 4th on the list, behind cosmetics. This probably isn't the most useful knowledge for you to learn right now, considering all these stores are going away. All 7 of them. In February of 2018, they announced they were going into bankruptcy, but they still had hope of survival. They were searching for someone to buy the company that was willing to keep it running, rather than just liquidating everything. I liken it to someone trying to sell an old car. It has transmission issues and rust everywhere. not the best car on the road. The person's trying to sell this car to someone that'll continue driving it around, rather than just tearing it apart and selling off all the parts. In the case of Bonton, their car was too beat up. They couldn't find anyone that was willing to keep it on the road. Now they're going the way of liquidation, and all the parts are being sold.
A bankruptcy judge has approved the sale of a company to a liquidator.
And the question that we're interested in is, why was it in such a bad condition? What made it so bad that they couldn't find anyone willing to keep it going? Remember in 2005 when they bought all those store chains from Saks? They paid them $1.1 billion, and they didn't have $1.1 billion just lying around. Practically the entire amount was funded by debt. Here's a graph that shows their long-term debt since 2003. If I hadn't told you the year of the acquisition, you'd think you'd be able to guess it by looking at this. It happened in 2005, but it was finalized in 2006. And I'm sure you can also tell that they haven't been able to bring it down all that much over the past decade. Today, the debt has a different structure than it did in 2006, but it's still there. The top line here shows their payment due dates of this debt. It's from their 2016 annual report, so that 1 to 3 year section is where we're at right now, and that 3 to 5 year section doesn't look all that good either. The bottom line here is in 2006 they took out a lot of debt to fund that acquisition, and now that they have to pay it back, they can't. The reason they can't pay it back is a little more obvious. When they agreed to all that debt, they were hoping all those new stores would generate enough revenue to cover it, and it hasn't been the case. Here's a graph showing their revenue since the acquisition. It's been going down pretty steadily. To further support this, here's a graph of their comparable store sales, which is an average of how each store is doing compared to how it did the year before. For example, in 2008, your local Carson store had 7.4% fewer sales than the year before, going by averages. Almost every year, each store is selling less than they did the year before. Even the few years that are in the positive aren't too far into the positive. Now, of course, I should show their net income graph as well. It's also unimpressive. They've been losing money every year since 2011, and it's starting to become clear why they haven't been able to reduce that debt by much. Maintaining high debt like that also leads to high interest expenses, which is also hurting things. Sure, their sales were bad, but we could also point to their interest expense as a reason for their negative income. Look at this. There's the line for their interest expense. It shows in 2016 they paid more than $66 million in interest. And if we compare that to their net income down here, we can see that their income would have been positive had they not had that interest expense, which isn't realistic, but it helps prove how much it's affecting them. It's the same case for every year on here. There's a lot of different aspects to this, and we can go deeper and deeper, but the broad answer to what happened to Bonton is the sales. It's a department store. Those haven't been doing well because we have the internet. And Bonton is being hit harder than many others because a lot of their locations are in shopping malls, which also aren't doing well. If people stop going to malls, they lose that traffic. I'm talking about the people popping in to look around and they end up buying something, the people who couldn't find what they wanted at Macy's and find themselves in a Bonton store looking for it. There's a reason these stores were attached to a mall in the first place. They even mention this exact thing in the risk factor section of their annual report. Reduced customer traffic in traditional shopping malls could have a material adverse effect on our financial condition and results of operations. I'd say these factors would account for that reduction in revenue over the years. To summarize everything into one sentence, what happened to Bonton? In 2005, they took out over $1 billion in debt so they could buy a bunch of department stores, many of which were attached to malls. If you just heard that one sentence and knew nothing else about this company, you'd be expecting hard times for them right about now. Let me know in the comments, what made you click on this video? Are you one of the few that's familiar with Bon-Ton stores, or did you somehow know that Bon-Ton owned one of those other stores that you're familiar with? Or maybe you were just curious to see what it was. Again, I had tremendous trouble labeling this episode in a way that conveyed that it affects 7 different department store chains, so I'm glad it was able to catch your attention and you were able to make it this far. Also, let me know if you agree with my conclusions. There's a few different layers to this, but in the end, the reasoning is pretty clear and probably not far from what you expected in the first place. Stories like this are always sad. 7 separate stores, most of which go back to the 1800s, and they're all closing as we speak. Unless something magical happens, we're in the final months of all of them. I suppose if you want to find some kind of a silver lining, you could probably go out and find some pretty good deals while they liquidate. If you're in the South, there's probably not one near you, and it's not worth the trip. I'm sorry about that. But for you, it's hard to miss what you never really knew. Oh, and if you do know any of these, which ones? How is your local news reporting this? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.